Having microphone issues already. I'm sorry. Eric was nice enough to get us new technology, and I'm always fumbling and whatnot. So, as we often say, good morning. And if you'll turn with me to the book of Jeremiah, chapter 1, as we look at the subject, enough. God willing, I'll try to set a little bit of context to the mic. I can work with the mic. Maybe there's a podium Sunday. We'll see. Somebody asked me to kind of not. Okay, anyway, we'll just try to preach and set the context, and hopefully the lesson will be yours after, once again, maybe 3 or 4 points and a wrap. Bottom line is, Jeremiah, if you've heard the story before, a young man called quite possibly before he thought he was ready to do the things that God was asking him to do. The thing that caught my attention this time, however, was his tribe. He's from the tribe, or he's not from the tribe of Benjamin. He has to be a Levite because he's from the priests. But he's set in the territory of Benjamin. And why does that matter? Well, the tribe of Benjamin, they were known for being pretty mighty warriors for a while until they became so mighty that it actually had the reverse effect. They decided that at the end of the book of Judges, they were so mighty they did not have to turn over some fugitives that basically hailed from their territory. And they decided they were going to fight 10 of the other tribes, or really all 11 other tribes, because they were really just that mighty. And in the early part of the battle, they really were who they thought they were. They held off the other 11 tribes to the point where the other 11 are going back to God. They're like, God, are we really supposed to? He's like, yeah, just keep going. Why? Because he was upset with the entire nation. And so they were all taking losses because of the way that the nation had descended at the time of the judges. But eventually, Benjamin continued to fight until they were almost completely decimated. And there were almost none of them left, to the point where they had to look for the remaining soldiers' wives from the other tribes. And the story of how they got the wives was kidnapping. But this was not a great period in Israel's history. But as in life, God gives us opportunities to bounce back. And so by the time they decide they want a king, God's not happy about giving them a king, because this is basically saying, God, you're not enough. And so as I think it's Samuel is going to anoint a king, guess which tribe he's going to come from? Second chance, Benjamin, what are you going to do? Well, we're going to give you a man by the name of Saul, who was a great king for a while, but as things improved, they didn't stay improved for very long. And so ultimately, by the time we see Jeremiah, a son of one of the Levites coming from the territory of Benjamin, it's not like what it's going to be by the time we get back to Paul, because in Paul's day, he's bragging about being from the tribe of Benjamin again, right? But this is that in-between period where we don't know exactly whether or not Jeremiah is where he wants to be in life. Understanding that the choice jobs or assignments, they're all in Jerusalem. Why? That's where the temple is, da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da. But he's in the tribe of Benjamin, doing what he has to do. Why? Because God had dispersed the priests throughout the land. Why? Because they were not simply doing priestly things. They were literally judging the territories in the courts that would listen and still bring their cases to court. And so they had the responsibility for settling disputes that did not go before their supreme court or their king in Jerusalem. So understand, as Jeremiah is there, it doesn't say how happy he was with his life or his assignment in Benjamin. But what it does say is he's about to be super unhappy about what God is now going to call him to do. And that is the context in which I'm going to read the whole first chapter. It's only 19 verses. But God willing, I'll set the context, give you at least 3 or 4 things that I saw, and the lesson will be yours. As verse 1 of Jeremiah 1 will say, the words of Jeremiah, the son of Hilkiah, one of the priests who were in Anathoth in the land of Benjamin, to whom the word of the Lord came in the days of Josiah, the son of Ammon, king of Judah, in the 13th year of his reign. It came also in the days of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, and until the end of the 11th year of Zedekiah, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, until the captivity of Jerusalem in the 5th month. Now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. Then I said, oh, Lord, behold, I do not know how to speak, for I am only a youth. But the Lord said to me, do not say I am only a youth, for to all whom I send you, you shall go. And whatever I command you, you shall speak. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver you, declares the Lord. Then the Lord put out his hand and touched my mouth, and the Lord said to me, behold, I have put my words in your mouth. See, I have set you this day over nations and kingdoms, to pluck up and to break down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant. And the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Jeremiah, what do you see? And I said, I see an almond branch. Then the Lord said to me, you have seen well, for I am watching over my word to perform it. The word of the Lord came to me a second time, saying, what do you see? And I said, I see a boiling pot facing away from the north. Then the Lord said to me, out of the north disaster shall be let loose upon the inhabitants of the land. For behold, I am calling all the tribes of the kingdoms of the north, declares the Lord, and they shall come. And everyone shall set his throne at the entrance of the gates of Jerusalem, against all its walls around and against the cities of Judah. And I will declare my judgments against them for all their evil in forsaking me. They have made offerings to other gods and worshipped the works of their own hands. But you dress yourself for work. Arise. Say to them everything I command you. Do not be dismayed by them, lest I dismay you before them. And I, behold, I make you this day a fortified city, an iron pillar and bronze walls, against the whole land, against the kings of Judah, its officials, its priests, and the people of the land. They will fight against you, but they shall not prevail against you, for I am with you, declares the Lord, to deliver you. First and foremost, I don't know how you've usually heard this passage preached, but over the years it's been super encouraging for me back when I was actually a young man. But I'm not a young man anymore. And so this time I had to find encouragement in a different way. It didn't so much jump off the page to me right away. But as I mentioned before, I do know what it's like after that young period of my life when I was super optimistic about the things that life might have had ahead for me, to slow down. And as we've talked about before, look at life from a more realistic perspective. And understanding the fact that he is starting out in the land of Benjamin, as we said. If he wasn't happy with where he was, it's kind of like they say about the weather in certain places. If you don't like the weather, just wait a few minutes because it's about to change. But he was not necessarily happy with the way that it was going to change, because before he was ready for whatever he thought he necessarily had in front of him, God was going to call him to do some things that he seemed to think he was too young to accomplish. And one of the things I thought about in terms of the whole concept of enough really focused around the part of the passage where God rebukes him and say, don't say that you're only a youth, in verse 7. For to all whom I send you, you shall go, and whatever I command you to say, you shall speak. And this passage really kind of, I guess, really began to relate, or I began to really relate to the passage more in the lives I saw this week. Not people that I actually met, but I started listening to a new musician this week, maybe about a week ago. And he's a young man who's a rapper, but he's got no arms. He's got one arm. It partially goes down, I guess, mid-sternum. But I started to realize that this young man, as he was talking about his times when we talked about our brother had a friend who wanted to commit suicide, part of his music is talking about the times when he didn't want to necessarily live. He's not making happy music. He's talking about music that allows him to be happy now, but it comes because there were times he couldn't look in the mirror and honestly answer the question, do you love yourself? There were times when he thought about what he wanted to have ahead for him, and the only thing he really wanted to have was not really anything else. He didn't want to see another day. And so I am looking at this passage now from the perspective of that young man who now stands on stage talking to people or rapping to people who I'm watching quote his lyrics in a way I hadn't seen people quote lyrics before. Why? Because whether you like rap music or not, it's an era of music in general where people are talking about, well, the lyrics are kind of shallow. So even people who used to like the music now look at it like, I have a hard time listening to it because, one, what are you talking about? There's a whole genre called mumble rap. And it's called mumble rap because you can't understand what they're saying because they're mumbling. And so now in this environment, understand what this young man is talking about as a youth. Jeremiah doesn't necessarily grow up in era mumble rap, but there are still some labels for his generation that don't necessarily seem like they're going to open doors for him talking to people who are more seasoned and experienced on the issues he's talking about. But the one thing I started to see, as I started to see people of all age groups in this young man's crowd quoting his lyrics in an era where people are pretty dismissive of what they're hearing in the music now, is they seem to be feeling this young man who was born with no arms on a deeply spiritual level in the way I hadn't seen people quoting lyrics in years. And so now this man who is coming up in a generation where, one, he's a Christian rapper. Christian rappers are generally considered cheesy because they got to say Jesus 5 times in every song. In an era where the music is considered shallow, and there are people who are quoting this young man who quite possibly would not have been equipped to reach that wide an audience of people if he hadn't gone through the times where he wondered whether or not he wanted to even see another day. And while his music isn't going to reach everybody, I'm not expecting you to become a rap fan just because I'm mentioning a new young man that I'm listening to. Understand that there are some things in your life, if you're anything like me and the folks I grew up around, where you're going to feel ill-equipped for a few things. And the thing that this passage began to show me as an old man, no longer looking on life with that fresh perspective I used to have, is to the degree I still feel ill-equipped for the very things that I seem like I need to do. Like it seems like before the era of, new technology that we got, it'd be pretty cool to be able to hold a microphone. This young man had it on his heart to rap in an era where he would like to be able to hold a microphone. How's he going to do that? But understand, those are sometimes the shallower details of what he's being called to do. What he was able or eventually equipped to do was speak to people on a level that goes beyond or defies, as we said, his age, his appearance, and the thing that he was called to do. But beyond that, that young man reminded me of the time when I was a youth minister. And one of my favorite preachers, especially one of my favorite preachers to talk to the kids about, was a young man who had no arms and no legs, which reminded me of what's coming up in the next set of verses as we continue on. Verse 9. Then the Lord put out his hand and touched my mouth. And the Lord said to me, behold, I have put my words in your mouth. See, I have set you this day over nations and over kingdoms, to pluck up and to break down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant. Understanding that there is a level of confidence that God can instill in me that can say, okay, he's empowered me to do this thing, but if you will, please just let me slide in to a corner of the room where nobody has to notice me because I am tired of the attention. Can you imagine what it's like walking into a room, because he can't get around, where as much as people want, they're going to be tempted to stare. And the young man who grew up with no arms, when he looks at a preacher with no arms and no legs, is going to be able to appreciate a little bit better. Wait a minute. I might be the only one I've met, but I'm not the only one. But this passage is helping me to understand that even though your deficiencies might make you want to go into the opportunities that God has for you, just kind of sliding into a corner of the room where nobody notices you because you're tired of the attention that you're getting, he's saying, I'm putting you over some things that don't allow you to slide into a place that's comfortable. I need you to stand up with courage, because if you embrace your struggle with what I'm really giving to you, you're not going to have to worry. Why? Because he's saying, I'm putting my words in your mouth. And so to the degree you're still worried and you're still dismayed, what you're doing is taking too much of the responsibility on your gifts and your talent and what I have given you to equip you. And you're forgetting that your strength and your confidence is going to come from the fact that no matter, we say it from time to time, no matter how talented you are, you still need to stay closely plugged in to what I'm telling you to do or say. And so that nervousness, that's a real thing, because by the time we get to verse 17, he's going to say, but you dress yourself for work. Arise and say to them everything that I command you. Do not be dismayed by them, lest I dismay you before them. We've talked about it before. Dry mouth bombing. God will add to you if you falter in the presence of people who he's told you to stand in front of in times when you just want to kind of take a back seat. He will add to your anxiety additional failure in certain circumstances, or that's at least what he's talking about to Jeremiah. And so there are times when I can want to take on a level of humility as an excuse to let go of the responsibility to which God has actually called me. And so sometimes I can call it humility when it's really me just wanting an easier path. And God says there is no easier path, because if you shiver, I'm going to make your legs shake. And it's going to get worse if you don't, one, like we said, understand the responsibility I've given you, the fact that I'm calling you to fulfill that responsibility, not just the portion you want. And if you walk that tightrope, it may feel like it's a tightrope, it's going to go well. Otherwise, bad news is, yeah, you can fall. The good thing about that young man who was the preacher is that I envision in my story, or my version of his story, one of his struggles in life was a part of the struggle I could easily relate to. He was like, God, how am I ever going to get married like this? And I just envision in my retelling of his story, God saying, I don't think she's going to care. And that she is the woman you see hugging on him across his back right there. And even though the picture may not get it across, yes, she is amazing. And hopefully I'm not being rude by saying that, but I can acknowledge God blessed him with a beautiful wife and that's a cute, yeah, you know, and a beautiful family. And so understand the thing that I seemed to see in Jeremiah's story this time. It's something I once heard from, anybody remember the old Star Trek? The old episodes of Spock? Did you ever know Spock had a girlfriend? In one episode, he had a love interest. And just like it goes, sometimes when you go home, you get to see the old girlfriend, boyfriend again, right? And then you get to, well, in that episode, she had moved on, but she wasn't married yet. And there was a young man who was a little bit, because Spock was kind of a big deal now. He resented the fact that Spock had once spent time with the young lady that he was now interested in. And Spock, understanding that he had more to do, he basically left, as you would guess, with a word of logic, Vulcan wisdom, saying, you all are welcomed to move forward. But he's like, one of the things I've learned in life, this is my reinterpretation, is the wanting is very different from the having. Understanding that Spock, I'm guessing, I don't know what his emotions were, he realized something that those writers were, I think trying to get across to us, and that is the way in which, in life, the wanting of a thing is very different than that which it is essential to have to maintain it. And so I am guessing that this preacher, when he was going through his own period of life, when he thought that he was completely ill-equipped to basically have any woman, when he was likewise going through his own period of time where he will tell you he did not want to see another day. This young man who can now swim and is preaching, he tried to drown himself in his family's bathtub. Can you imagine if this young man, after God willing, woke him up, if he was successful, and God showed him what could have been in his life if he had not given up. If God showed him that he basically had killed himself before he met her, before he met his kids, before he gave God an opportunity to not simply equip him to get married, but quite possibly be the kind of person who is ready not to just do the having, but to maintain the relationship in a way where, I've said it before, I'm not married, but I've heard marriage is tough. And I guess after you get to a point, after I've heard from enough couples, where God willing, you reach a point where you just mutually respect one another. You love one another. And in spite of the difficulties, you're able to bond with one another in a way that all those bumps along the road, you look back on them and you say, maybe it was worth it, right? Maybe this young man and all the bumps he had along the way before he ever met her had a lot of those problems smoothed out so that he wouldn't just appreciate the having or the wanting. He would appreciate the having in a way that would allow her to respect him in a way that he just might not have been able to if he always had his legs, always had his arms, and he always had everything everyone else had. So I can't say whether or not that's the case. That's me superimposing my idealized version of their marriage from my single perspective. But at the end of the day, I know God does not leave you without. And if he has given you a struggle, the temptation is to see life through the lens of that limitation, as opposed to the way in which God, like you said, in my version or my telling of the story, might be telling you, I don't think she's going to care whether you got arms or legs, buddy. And I think y'all are going to make it okay. Understand that. That is not necessarily any of our struggles, but we all have something. Understand this. One of the reasons why books like the book of Jeremiah, in the respect that it reminds me so much of the struggles in the life and the ministry of Christ, is that these stories, just like that young man who was born without arms and he's now rapping to crowds who feel him on a very different level. Not every audience is going to feel him. I've seen some crowds that he raps in front of, and they kind of just look at him just kind of like, oh, that's interesting. A guy with no arms, he's hopping around on stage, and okay. But understand, that's the same basically parallel for our stories. See, one of the ways it's really easy to get discouraged on the gift that God has given you is to expect it to translate to every crowd. We talked a little bit about the sophomore slump. I think it was on Wednesday. You don't necessarily have a sophomore slump if you didn't start out good freshman year. And so there are times in life where you're going to start out real well. You are finally going to hit your stride, and whatever it was that seemed like a liability is going to start going super well. Oh, but then he may bring you into that sophomore year where the crowds aren't clapping quite as loud anymore. The applause isn't as heavy, and folks ain't quoting your lyrics anymore because they've heard them already, and they want a new album. And so, understand, God has painted for Jeremiah a very realistic picture of what success is going to be like. And so this is yet another story. A lot of it's review, but it's review through the lens of another life where God is giving them the bright side. Like in Isaiah, we saw the 2 days. You got the day of redemption, the day of joy. He paints an amazing picture of what things are going to be like. Why? So you don't quit in the middle of the days of accountability, the days of refinement, the days when the fire is going to test you and make you want to quit, to the point where you might be tempted to quit before you meet her, or flip it, whatever your ambition is at this point. The thing that God is preparing Jeremiah to do is to understand the baggage that goes along with it. And part of the baggage is this, is that once I hit the sophomore year, the junior year, the applause isn't as loud. We've said it before. My tendency is to try to, you've heard of focus groups? Focus groups are those small groups they put together where they test whether or not what you say is appealing to the crowd and which parts of what you say you might want to leave out as opposed to keep in to make sure you keep the attention of the crowd where you'd like it to be. Focus groups can be super effective as long as they aren't compromising the substance of what God has called you to do. And so you want to be able to use tools like focus groups to the degree that they can enhance your message, your style, your approach, but they don't influence you so much that you become basically captivated by the need to be appreciated by every audience, right? That was too high a bar for the Christ. And so when he's helping us see in Jeremiah, very last verse, 19, they will fight against you, but they shall not prevail. They will fight against you, but they shall not prevail against you, for I am with you, declares the Lord, to deliver you. He's helping them understand that he's giving them the end of the story from the beginning, because after all of these years passed during Jeremiah's ministry, one of the few who's going to be left standing, we talked about that remnant in the book of Isaiah. God is now pulling his prophet out of that remnant, because whether or not he knows it, there's going to be a lot of upheaval that is going to happen in the environment around him in Judah. But one of the last people who is going to be left standing is Jeremiah. And in order to survive the time, they're going to have to pull him out of a cistern. They're going to have to pull him out of a place where he was left behind during the time when everybody else was carted off. And as we got a chance to see during the reign of Cyrus, there was a time in Israel where the tragedy was happening first to God's people. Much like we'll see at the end of times in the Revelation, there are two harvests described in the end of days. One is just a harvest. The other is the harvesting of the grapes of wrath. And there is a time in life where it's going to seem like the hard times are coming to you, and people who are, aren't the least bit interested in doing the things that God has asked them to do will be able to point and mock effectively asking you if you really are serving God, where is he now? And you were calling us to serve him, but that doesn't look like a great advertisement for what God is capable of doing. But in those circumstances, he's calling us to understand that he always has two harvests. And the revelation, that second harvest, is the one that you want to stay away from. Isaiah literally said they did the same thing in the days of, or they would do the same thing in the days of the deportation, not realizing that those who were pulled out of the land in the first wave of deportations were being saved from all of the misery that was about to come. And so in life, there are times when it's going to seem that hard times are coming to you. This is another passage, like we said, a lot of it's just review, because it's super similar to a period in Israel's history where when he brought them out of the land of Egypt, before that, sending 10 plagues on the land to convince the people of Egypt to let them go, there was a small territory called the land of Goshen that we've talked about before. What he's doing now in the first chapter of Jeremiah is saying, just like I carved out a land of Goshen for my people during the Exodus, it's going to point all the way forward to the new covenant. When he says, just as God considers it after he says God considers it just to repay those who torment you with torment, he's going to say, just as he was able to preserve a people in the days of Sodom and Gomorrah and his previous judgments, pointing forward to the end of all things. One of the reasons why you don't want to give up on what it is that God still has for you is he's saying these lessons are an anchor for what he is about to do, even as days get more difficult. Jeremiah is another reminder of the way he is able to carve out peace in times that otherwise seem absolutely miserable. And so understand that still comes at a cost, though. One of the reasons why that everything from verse 17 is important is it's not the first time he says it. And we say repetition sometimes breeds emphasis. In verse 7, he's going to say, you're going to have courage. After he says, do not say, I am only a youth. For to all to whom I send you, you shall go. And whatever I command you, you shall speak. I told you before that story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came up. I think it was on the radio not too long ago, and the preacher was being super encouraging about the implications that it has for our lives. And I smarted off to God, not with mouth, but in mind. And I was like, God, you just don't seem to be showing up for me like that. And you remember the story. It was almost as if either my conscience or God got to me and said, are you taking on that level of challenge? See, because I was asking him to bless me with miraculous signs in my life when I wasn't doing anything miraculous. And understand how he's helping us to see the very same thing in the book of Jeremiah. If all I'm doing is asking God for, as we say sometimes, fulfillment of 10 ambitions, I got to ask myself, what kind of challenges have I taken on? Going back to the illustration we used from David and Goliath, right? He slew Goliath, but Goliath was Goliath. And there are times when I have Goliath ambitions, but remember David had other brothers? And what were the other brothers doing when David was stepping up to the plate before Goliath? They were back with everybody else, trying to find somewhere to hide. That's not a bad thing. Why? Because my courage, at least the little bit of courage I have now, has been developed over the years. But the real part of having ambitions is having healthy expectations. One of the reasons why I talk about confession so often is not necessarily just for the benefit it has for healing relationships within the body, but confession is sometimes the platform God uses to get me where I need to be. And so after that young man began he wrote a book with his wife about finding love in spite of what he saw in the mirror. One of the things that both of those young men had in common was they had a period in their life where they stopped looking at their life through the lens of all the things that they had been denied. And they began to take responsibility of the way in which all the things that they had been denied caused them to shrink even further into places of hiding where they weren't making the most of what God had actually given them. And that is the frightening thing about life. It is not so much the things that I have grown up without. It is the degree to which they can cause me to shrink back even further and not reach the potential that God really has given me with what I have. And so with that, understand that when he is calling Jeremiah, it's like another one of those David moments. Don't kill your 10 ambitions. If we're talking about scale of 1 to 10, But be really honest with yourself as you look in the mirror about how much you've actually lived up to the potential that God has given you. And don't necessarily drop your ambitions down from 10 to 5 if you're at a 5, or if you're really honest with yourself, I'm really giving a 2 level of effort. Not necessarily my own stuff, because we tend to give a lot of effort to our own stuff, right? But I don't always think about the way in which my preoccupation with my ambitions is affecting what God has called me to do. See, because Jeremiah he already seemed like he was pretty close to God, right? I mean, he's from the family of the priests, right? But what he was already doing for God wasn't enough to fulfill what God had given him the potential to do. In spite of his youth, in spite of his limitations, in spite of his inability seemingly to speak well even as a youth, God had something that he was going to give Jeremiah the ability to do if he was willing to legitimately just reach for the potential to do what he already had. And so with that, one of the reasons why I like this review, and I know there's a lot of review. You probably heard all this a lot. It's kind of tough to take on a passage that everybody's heard before. They know most of the points, they know most of the story, and they know most of the encouragement or the discouragement and the rebuke. But the bottom line is this. Life, we say, as soon as you leave those doors, it always has a funny way of throwing a new twist on an old challenge in a way that, God willing, will allow you. As you hopefully begin to go with me through the book of Jeremiah on your own, you will be able to pick up nuances on the nuances, I guarantee, that the enemy has for you. God willing, that will help you overcome the temptation to shrink back into comfortable places. When God is telling you, you really have the potential, if you really just, like we say, just take one more step and continue to trust me and don't quit, he has the potential to put you over some things that right now you can't even imagine yourself fitting into at this point. And so the Bible says, both junctures, it's one of those paradoxes. You don't put God to the test, but there are times when he says, test me. And insofar as he's literally made you a promise, that's an area where it may be okay to test him. And so with that, my prayer for you is my prayer for me. That God willing, no matter what it is that you seem to be lacking, that you realize that God has given you enough to probably do, as he said, more than you could ever ask or think. As we together stand and sing.